Uh, Thanks so much, Mark. This is a really cool opportunity for me. Very thankful for your reaching out and for Blue Dot for having me. Um, just a little bit of context about my background. I'm a researcher at the NYU Stern Tech and Society Lab. I work with Jonathan Haidt. If any of you know him, he does a lot of research in the past, mainly pertaining to social media and adolescent health, but increasingly more work on AI as well. Although this project just grew out of some personal writing and research I was doing on my Substack. And so wrote an article which was originally just on my Substack, was eventually picked up by Transformer, which is a great publication also on Substack that reports on all things AI, especially AI policy, and got a lot of attention for this paper, which I think is great because I think this is a really important issue given how influential, like Mark has said, the METR graph has been in AI policy and safety discourse. So with that, I'm going to get going. This shouldn't take more than around 20 minutes. I think what I'll do is just have folks save questions for the end, but feel free to type them in the chat if you want. If you don't want to save them until later or just want to be able to remind yourself, I can go through the chat at the end of the presentation and run through those or answer questions based on raised hands, whatever's best. Okay, here we go. So I'm Nathan. This is presentation version of my paper on the METR graph. So I thought first, since we're obviously reading my critique and the paper, we would just go over in brief the structure of the paper, how the research was actually conducted, which I think can be a little bit intimidating reading through the entire paper, but is overall, I think, relatively simple. So there's 3 steps, and this is just a graphic from the paper itself. First, the METR team is collecting a diverse range of tasks that are at different difficulty levels. And those are from 3 subsidiary data sets, some of which are created by METR. I know that HCAST and WeBench are. I'm less sure about SWAA suite. But these tasks are collected together. They aren't tasks taken from real world software engineering labor. They're sort of contrived tasks created by METR and other research teams that are cleaned up such that they can be used more easily to evaluate AI models. The next step after these tasks are collected is for a set of human baseliners to complete the tasks themselves under time constraints. METR collects those baselines to see on average how long each task takes the human experts that they've recruited. And then AI models complete the exact same tasks. And then they do what they've called their time horizon analysis to basically figure out, okay, how long do models take to complete these tasks as a function of how long they take humans. And that last step takes us into some slightly technically complicated territory, but which is a lot less intimidating, I think, than it looks. So don't worry if this figure is a little bit crazy from the outset. We're going to talk through it. Basically, what's happening here is the sort of bar graphs that you're seeing in the background, in the sort of back layer of the figure, are just telling you for different models, which are stratified based on the color coding here, how successful they are completing tasks that take humans different amounts of time. So the task length that you're seeing at the bottom is sometimes it's gotten confusing for people trying to interpret this research online. That's not telling you how long models take to complete the tasks. That's telling you how long it takes humans to complete the tasks. And then the bar graph, the colored bars are just telling you the average success rates over multiple runs of different AI models completing those same tasks themselves. And then to get the success probabilities that actually end up on the influential METR graph, what they are doing is fitting these curves, which you can see here, to these bar graphs of success rates as a function of human completion times. And then they are just looking at where the curves intersect with the 50% point on the y-axis, which is tracking success probability. If that's still a little bit confusing, don't worry. I think just talking through it based on the figure that's gone sort of viral itself will be clarifying. This is the graph that you've probably seen a million times all over social media. On the bottom, you have just time, when are different models released. On the y-axis, you have those task durations based on human completion times. And then the points on the graph are just telling you the times at which models cross that 50% threshold that we talked about on the previous slide. So that's just the dotted line, oopsie, the dotted line right here. And so they're collecting model runs, evaluating their success rates as a function of these human completion times, fitting a logistic curve to those graphs, and then looking at where that curve intersects the 50% probability to determine which time is each model's 50% success time horizon, if you will. And that's what you're seeing displayed here. So this is also this is a linear scale. The log scale sort of itself looks like a linear line going up. We'll see an example of that in a second. One thing to notice that will become pertinent as we move through the presentation is just that there's obviously this sort of big apparent leap in capability over at the right edge of the graph that at least putatively corresponds to the sort of rise of reasoning models and AI agents of the Claude Opus variety, which obviously had a lot of influence and inspired a lot of discourse in the recent past. And, well after I had actually agreed to give this talk, we obviously had a big kind of viral moment for the graph again when the time horizon for Claude Opus 4.6 came out and came in at 14 and a half hours, which, again, if you take the graph at face value, implies this massive capability speed up in terms of the complexity and time intensiveness of tasks that AI models can complete. So that caused a lot of discussion. Now what you're seeing here is another influential part of the paper, which is usually known as like the doubling time graph. Basically, all this is tracking is on a logarithmic or exponential scale, how fast are frontier models doubling the task lengths that they can complete at 50% reliability. The reason you're seeing two overlaid lines here is because at the end of January, METR updated their time horizon methodology a bit. Mostly those updates aren't super important for my purposes. They don't really deal in a direct way with any of my criticisms, so I'm not going to talk about that in a ton of detail. But what you're seeing here is that after this update, which is what they're calling TH time horizon 1.1, the doubling time got a fair amount faster. So 131 days for models to move from, just to give an example, 10-minute 50% time horizon to a 20-minute 50% time horizon. So they're saying that doubling is now happening at a rate of 131 days, whereas they originally found it to be happening at a rate of 165 days. So they now think that model capabilities are improving sort of even faster than they were before. Okay, great. So I'm not going to talk in a ton of detail about the rest of the paper, but I'm happy to get into the paper in whatever level of detail folks want in the Q&A. For now, I'm just going to move into some of my criticisms of the paper, which, to be polite, I'm calling limitations, but I think that, they're in a lot of cases more severe than just limitations. And that sort of comes through in the tone I've used in the past in my writing to talk about this paper. So this is just a summary, and I'm going to go through each one of them in more detail. So the first thing is just that the tasks themselves are unrealistic. That's something that METR has been very upfront about, to their credit. For various reasons, the tasks are not good representations of the sorts of tasks that real-world software engineers complete. That's one major criticism or limitation. The second criticism is just that the baselines, the human baselines they're collecting to figure out what those per task time horizons are very unreliable for a whole host of reasons. And most of my criticisms pertain to one of those three data sets of tasks that they're testing models on, the HCAST data set. The reason for that is that HCAST is really far and away the most important of those three task data sets that they're testing models on. And the reason why is that basically every dot on the graph corresponds to tasks in the HCAST data set, not tasks in the other two data sets. So I think only like the first two data points And with the introduction into the Horizon suite of Claude Opus 4.6, the last data point, the really high one, are non-HCAST tasks. And we actually can't say for certain whether that last one is non-HCAST because HCAST contains some very long tasks as well. But long story short, mostly when you're talking about the actual test suite of tasks that METR are using, they're using these HCAST tasks. And so that's where my criticisms are focused. Another criticism about those is just that the test suite for HCAST is pretty heavily contaminated. So a lot of those tasks were already public. In a lot of cases, which I was surprised to find out, the task solutions are already public, which means that, in my opinion, they really shouldn't be used in benchmarking at all. And then the last criticism, which only became relevant recently with some of these more impressive data points coming from agentic and reasoning models, is that the really long tasks are not actually based on, in the vast majority of cases at least, real human baselines. They're based on estimates by the METR team. And so we don't have much empirical data to back up those time horizons. Okay. Apologies also if I'm moving through this pretty quickly. We're going to dive into more detail now. So just covering the first criticism, the tasks being unrealistic. So what you're seeing on the right here is just directly from METR. This is in the paper. So they run through the various sources of unrealism that they're worried about and that I think we should all be worried about. I'm not going to read these word for word, but one is that all the tasks are sort of automatically scorable. So they need to be highly constrained in a way that makes that tractable to do. They don't involve interacting or coordinating with other agents. It's just, this one agent completing this one task. They don't face any sort of real resource constraints in completing the tasks. They're unpunishing of singular mistakes. So they're made to be sort of robust to a lot of bad or poor behavior by the models. Then the environments themselves are static. There aren't things kind of changing in the background as the models work. So this is an interesting aspect of the paper that I want to get into in some more detail, is that METR scores all of their tasks based on what they call a messiness score. And so they identify these like 16 different factors, which they say make tasks more messy. And in their own words, that means basically more realistic, right? So this is a direct quote from them in the paper. They say that messiness is representative of how real world tasks may systematically differ from our tasks, right? And so a lot of these are just repeats of what we already saw on this slide with some additional factors, whether it's a novel situation, whether the model has to, in some sense, improve itself or modify itself, whether or not you have some aspects of the scoring that are not as explicit. There is a section in the paper, pages 39 through 40, I think it's in an appendix, where you can run through in a lot more detail what all of these different messiness factors actually mean. But for the most part, you should think about them in terms of this set of 5 differences between METR's tasks and realistic tasks, right? It really comes down to the idea that these are tasks that have been special built for model benchmarking. They're not taken from real world context, and they're sort of purposefully simplified such that they're digestible for models. They don't introduce kind of random ambiguities or noise that would make it difficult to find this kind of long-term trend that METR's interested in tracking. Okay, so this is a really important figure, which from what I gather, like almost no one had seen before I published my piece on the METR graph, despite the fact that in my view, it's like a really important figure. So what you're seeing here is METR's testing of model success rates on only the messiest half of tasks on the basis of these messiness factors that they've identified. So there's 16 of them, right? And so I don't know exactly how they're calculating this messiness score, but the point is that for the entire subset of tasks whose messiness score is below like median messiness, models are at no point, at least through March 2025, which is obviously, a while ago in AI world, which is why it'd be great to see an updated version of this graph. But at least as of March 2025, you're never seeing success rates above 30%. And that's pretty striking in my view because on the entire task suite, you're often seeing success rates that get into the 60s, 70s, 80s, and sometimes like 90s or even close to 100 for the simpler tasks, right? So that what that is telling me is that the results for the overall test suite are pretty heavily weighted on the least messy tasks, right? Because otherwise you wouldn't see quite this level of divergence between weighted success rates for the most messy 50% of tasks and the least messy 50% of tasks. And because you're seeing that, I think just immediate kind of gut check, you should be pretty skeptical of at least the exact time horizons that METR is identifying on the y-axis of the kind of viral METR graph, right? Because we know those tasks are unrealistic, and not only do we know that, we know when you filter for just the most realistic half of tasks, and I want to underscore that doesn't mean they're realistic, full stop, right? That just means they're more realistic, right? They're still unrealistic in the grand scheme of things. But when you filter down to just least realistic half, success rates are kind of falling off a cliff. And METR does make the claim in the paper that, okay, but if you fit, this exponential curve that we're interested in to just these messier tasks, it's still increasing at a similar rate. I have no reason to doubt that, but kind of eyeballing it, I think that they're probably overstating that just a little bit. And another reason that I think this figure is important to publicize is because I think it'd be really informative for METR to update this figure with new agentic and reasoning models, right? Because it would be really helpful to know if for this more realistic half of tasks, you still see this like huge exponential jump, especially in the past year or so. I'd personally love to know that. I think I'm a little skeptical they're going to make that figure public because I know that they're not super happy with this messiness analysis and they feel it was a little kind of ad hoc, and so they're going to do a new version that's more refined. But it would be interesting to see them publicize this graph again with Claude Opus 4.5 and 4.6 and GPT-5 and so on and so forth, because I pretty strongly suspect that you would not get the same exponential curve for the realistic tasks that you do for the entire task suite. Okay, great. So now I'm going to move on to talking about the HCAST baselines. And this, I think, is sort of the brunt of my critique because METR, to their credit, has talked a fair amount about the task messiness issue. Obviously, I'm showing you a graph that they produced there, right? So credit to them for doing that due diligence. I think this is an area, though, where in my mind, there's a pretty serious lapse of due diligence, especially in terms of how these results have been communicated to the public. So the first thing to say is that, like I tried to clarify before, any task with a time horizon that's more than 30 seconds and less than 8 hours is an HCAST task, right? And so real quick, if we just go all the way back to the METR graph, that includes every single dot on here except for the first two, if memory serves, and then the final one from Claude Opus 4.6. So in the METR paper, each of the three data sets from which tasks are drawn are sort of dealt with as if they're equally important almost. I mean, there's just sort of an equal length section for each task suite. But really the METR graph is all about the HCAST tasks. I mean, that is where the brunt of tasks are coming from. And so if there are issues with HCAST, those issues are not made less significant because there is a large set of other tasks here, because it's really those that are driving the results, right? So that's just something to get out of the way from the outset. Another issue in this same vein is that there's just not a lot of public information surrounding the exact amount of baselines per person and the exact amount of baseliners who are actually providing the empirical ground truth that METR is then using to construct the y-axis of the METR graph. So we know that there were 286 successful baselines across 97 HCAST tasks that made it into METR's long tasks benchmark. So to clarify, a lot of this information is not in the paper you will have read for today. It's coming from a separate paper surrounding the HCAST data set itself. And so that's also something that I think led to such a wide divergence between, in my view, what the real significance of the METR study is and its public perception. A lot of the information that you would need to formulate the critiques that I'm advocating for here is really coming from the HCAS paper and not necessarily coming from the METR paper itself. So with that said, you have 286 successful baselines, 97 HCAS tasks that actually made it into METR long tasks. Obviously this is envelope math, but that implies that you're getting something like 3 baselines per task. More realistically, you're probably getting 1 and maybe even 0 for some of the longer tasks, and you're getting, 4, 5, 6 for some of the really short tasks. It would be great for METR to release more public information surrounding how many baselines they got for each task, and also how many of those baselines were from the same people, right? And I think that's actually a really important issue I've also seen very little discussion of, is that it's not like all of these baselines represent a new person. And in fact, much more likely is that they usually don't, right? There's a relatively small group of baseliners. I think for the entire METR long tasks benchmark, there's 140, but we don't know how many are mainly providing baselines for HCAS tasks versus the rebench tasks or the SWAA tasks, right? So, we don't know whether or not all these baselines or a lot of these baselines come from a very small group of people. We don't know the number of baselines that are determining the average completion time per task, which is difficult information to not have when so many of these results are downstream from those human completion times. So all of that said, another final caveat before we move on from this slide is just that they added a bunch of new tasks in the methodology update at the end of January, time horizon 1.1. After going through that, don't see any real reason that should affect my criticisms much. If anything, the opposite is true because these are just more tasks from HCAST, right? Which are then subject to the exact same concerns that I've had with the initial set of HCAS tasks. Obviously, it's good to have more tasks. I mean, that sort of marginally increases the robustness of the results, I'd imagine. But ultimately, a lot of the problems that I have with the paper are operating at a sort of higher level of abstraction. And so I don't think that just adding new tasks from the same problematic data set is going to make a huge difference here. Okay. So what are the actual problems with the human baselines? And there are a bunch of them. So the first one, which they really haven't been super upfront about, which I found a little bit frustrating, is that the actual baseliners they're using are just a convenience sample of people who are known to METR employees, right? So there's no scientific sampling procedure of any kind going on in terms of recruiting baseliners. So it's very much not a random sample. The second thing to say is, convenience samples aren't unheard of in social science research, but when they happen, you get a lot of information surrounding how the convenience sample was actually collected, right? Whereas here, we really are completely in the dark, right? We don't know whether they're just DMing friends on LinkedIn. We don't know whether they're posting some sort of sign-up sheet in a group chat on Discord, or we don't really know anything about how the sample's being collected, which is obviously sort of a no-no in social science methodology, right? So that's the first worry. And just to emphasize again, this is not a representative sample, right? And so this introduces a lot of concerns from a generalization standpoint, because there are all sorts of potential divergences between the sample that METR is collected from their professional network and a random sample of software engineers from all around the United States, much less the entire world, right? They could be systematically younger. They could have gone to different schools. They could have all received different types of training. They could be more likely to be sort of part-time software engineers rather than full-time software engineers. They might be heavily focused on machine learning rather than other sort of more due diligence, kind of low-tech software engineering tasks that are less research adjacent. There are a million potential divergences. And so I got some responses to the paper to the effect that well, I mean, they're probably good software engineers. Like we have no reason not to trust these time horizon results. But you don't want to really play that game when it comes to social science, right? Like it's very hard to know, that is to say, from first principle, how a non-random sample might diverge from a random sample. And so you really should just follow the rules of getting a random sample. And so that is right off the bat a big problem for the extent to which you could generalize this study to all software engineers, right? Second big problem with the human baseliners is that they're paid by the hour. And that is also a huge problem, right? Because the data being collected from them is temporal data. It is data about how long it takes them to do something, right? So if you pay them by the hour, you are giving them a financial incentive to take longer, which is going to skew the data because presumably at least some of them are not, such upstanding people that they can't be swayed implicitly or explicitly by the promise of extra money for working, just a little bit slower on something that is probably a pretty low stakes task for them to begin with, right? I'm not saying I have any reason to suspect that's happening on a vast scale, but it's just poor social scientific practice, right? I'll add here that they did try to provide an extra incentive for people to work faster. They paid people a bonus if they completed the task faster than any other baseliner. But again, because you're getting more than one baseliner for a lot of these tasks, and sometimes, the average is something like 3, like we talked about earlier, for the average baseliner, it still makes more financial sense to slow down rather than to speed up, right? So yes, they tried to get around this problem. I don't think it was good enough. I think they should have designed their incentive structure differently. Next big criticism of the baseliner sample is that a lot of them lacked expertise that was pertinent to the task that they were given, right? And so this is a quote directly from the paper. METR found that baseliners spent over 25% of their time reminding themselves of relevant information to the task, like how to do port forwarding and how to do some other subset of the task that they may not have remembered. And they talk explicitly about how they often had trouble pairing baseliners with tasks that were a good fit for their expertise. So your assumption there should be that somewhat like the perverse incentive problem, you are probably inflating these baseline times potentially by quite a bit. And that's a problem, just sort of thinking bigger picture, because one of the ways this study is being interpreted is telling us something about how soon or how effectively agentic coding could substitute for human engineering labor, right? And so if the information we're getting is specific to engineers who are kind of working on tasks that they're unfamiliar with, then that's not going to give us a good sense of how capable models are at substituting for tasks that would otherwise be taken on by engineers who are experts in the field that those tasks are in, if that makes sense. So it is a problem that you are baselining folks who are a little bit unfamiliar with the tasks that they're being asked to complete most of the time. And to wrap all this up, there is information in the METR paper that confirms that you are probably seeing a substantial amount of baseliner inflation. We know from the paper itself that the baseliners that were recruited were around 5 to 18 times slower, depending on the task, than METR's own coders, so people who are maintaining METR's internal repositories. So right there, I mean, that's pretty strong evidence that you're dealing with quite a bit of baseline inflation. That's really problematic because it means that the y-axis is going to substantially overstate the capabilities of current models. Okay, so the next big issue is that, especially at the rightmost end of the curve, you're often dealing with tasks that are not actually baselined at all. And so we do not know how long it takes humans to complete them. And what you are actually getting is basically like guesstimates from METR employees, right? And the only information we have about how those were estimated is this quote that is the second bullet point here. Non-baseline estimates were based on information including the length of quality assurance runs that did not follow strict baseline conditions and the length of similar tasks with successful baselines, right? And so obviously this isn't super scientific. They're taking these times from quality assurance runs that don't match the conditions that baseliners were in, and so they're not intercomparable with the work that baseliners did and the times that were collected from them. And, in a lot of cases, I would imagine that they're sort of just guessing based on similar tasks. I don't think that they're collecting quality assurance completion times in every single case. And so these times are just really, really noisy. And it's especially important because of the large reaction that we just saw online to the new 14 and a half hour time horizon from Claude Opus 4.6. Um, a lot of people were sort of breathlessly reposting the updated graph with the new Opus time horizon, failing to understand that 4.5 number is nearly meaningless. I mean, I think that that is going to sound like excessively critical to a lot of folks, but I don't think it is. I mean, you just cannot trust that METR's guesstimated time horizons are accurate. It's just much better to have empirical samples from human beings, even if, like we talked about, those empirical samples are already just pretty heavily compromised, right? And so I just really think that you should be heavily discounting this most recent result surrounding Claude Opus 4.6. I think that to really update your views on AI progress in any substantive way based on that result is to be pretty seriously confused about the provenance of those numbers, how they're collected, what their significance is. Um, okay, so those are sort of my main criticisms. I'm going to run through just one of the big responses that I heard, and pretty soon we'll be able to break for questions. So a common response I heard was that a lot of these issues, while maybe they affect the scale of the y-axis, um, don't affect its slope, right? Because even if all the baselines are inflated, you can just sort of squeeze down the scale of the y-axis, and you'll be able to see whether or not the capability curve is the same slope that it would be for longer time horizons, right? The implication being that, okay, maybe you're right that the baselines are inflated, the exact numbers on the y-axis are inflated, but as long as capabilities are increasing at the same rate, then we're still going to get to AGI, extremely quickly, right? And METR even points out that even if you deflate the y-axis by like 10x, it's only pushing out the point at which they assess will reach AGI by like 4 or 5 years or something like that. And so that's a response I heard a lot. That basically you're nitpicking. It's the capability curve that matters. It's the doubling times that matter. It's not the actual scale of the y-axis. And in my view, that just could not be further from the truth. I don't think that's a remotely convincing response. So the first thing to say, and this is the last bullet point here, I'm going to go bottom up, is that even if that were right, it's not insignificant, right? Because no one expects exponential progress, however you measure it, to continue forever. And so it does really matter at which time horizon that curve starts to taper, right? So it's not like it's non-substantive what the scale of the y-axis is. If it's much, much smaller and exponential progress starts to taper earlier, then that still means that we're landing at models that have lesser capabilities than they otherwise would. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that response assumes that all of the problems that I'm concerned about affect all of the different tasks and all of the different time horizons equally. And we have no reason to think that's the case, right? So one reason I articulated in the essay itself is that inflation would almost certainly be affecting longer tasks than shorter ones, right? Because there's sort of a floor of how short the short tasks can get, and also the short tasks are easier, and so they're probably not super inflated. Whereas once you get up to longer tasks, like expert coders who have a lot of experience with those tasks can probably complete them a lot faster than coders that don't have experience in them. And so that means that the degree of baseline inflation is probably pretty heavily correlated with the time horizons themselves, i.e., the longer tasks. So just because this might help, I'm going to go back here. The longer tasks at the very far right of the curve are likely, if there is baseline inflation going on, to be much more heavily inflated than the shorter tasks, because the shorter tasks are easy enough that it's not like, being an expert at fixing bugs in small Python libraries is going to give you a huge temporal edge on any other coder, right? Since that's not the most difficult task in the world. But once you get up to fixing vulnerable, bugs in machine learning code bases, exploiting, this Ethereum smart contract example that they use on the left side of the screen there. Those are things that an expert coder is really going to get quite a large speed up completing relative to a non-expert. And so that means that the slope of the capability curve could actually taper quite a bit towards the rightward end of the graph if you do have something like baseline inflation. And so, in my mind, that's the main reason that you can't just shrug this off. The other thing to say is just that contamination risk is unevenly distributed. And going back through my slides, I'm actually noticing that I didn't get a chance to talk about that in a ton of detail. So I'm going to go back here and just mention it real quickly. But of the tasks that are in HCAST, around 2/3 were just already on the internet, and around 1/3 had solutions that are already public, right? And so that means that models are going to be much, much better at completing quite a large subset of HCAST tasks. And especially for that 1/3 that have public solutions, those just have no business being in the benchmark at all, right? It is not an assessment of models' capabilities to ask whether they can spit out a solution that is already on the open internet, right? And even for cases where the tasks are public and the solutions are not, even that is a real contamination risk, because if the task is already public, that means the model has seen it. It might have seen like forum posts that discuss parts of the solution or alternative solutions. There's a million reasons that having just the tasks themselves be public is a huge problem. Another reason is just because it means that frontier labs can benchmax, right, on the public tasks by just training their models over and over again to complete them, fine tuning, that's called, which would again overstate model capabilities relative to tasks that haven't been seen before. So that's another reason that you can't just assume that the rate of increase is resilient to changes to the scale of the y-axis, is because you also have these data contamination issues that are uneven, right? Contamination risk is not the same along the entire curve, which means that if you corrected for it somehow, it could affect a part of the curve more than another part of the curve, and that would change the slope of the capability curve. So it just really isn't the case that you can just shrink the y-axis and get around all of the problems that I'm concerned about here. Okay. We're running relatively low on time, so I'm probably going to speed through the rest of this. The last thing I want to say is just that you should be thinking not about any of these complaints in isolation. You should be thinking about how they might compound with one another, right? And so there's the task unrealism problem. There's the bias sample. There's the fact it's a really small sample, 3 baseliners per task, right? There's the perverse incentives. There's the data contamination. Like, if someone tells you that they are able to sort of process all of these limitations and spit out what the significance of the METR graph is, notwithstanding all of them, because they have assessed based on their model of the research how they might be biasing the results in one direction or another, you just really shouldn't believe them, right? Because there are just so many unpredictable ways these issues could be compounding one another that you really the proper takeaway is just to move on to a new piece of research, in my opinion, right? Like, it is really hard to run through all of these and be like, okay, I understand exactly how they're shaping the results, and so I can just take them for granted with a large grain of salt. In my opinion, that just understates the sheer degree of methodological challenge, with the METR graph and with interpreting it. I think that the right takeaway is probably just to move on to something else. And real quick, and then I'm gonna end so we have enough time for Q&A. There are a lot of better benchmarks to look at than METR. So this is a response I got a lot, is like, okay, maybe you're right, but METR is still the best thing we have. And that just isn't the case, in my view. There are a lot of benchmarks that are going to give you a much better idea of how to interpret the next several years in models' capability increases based on how they perform on more realistic tasks. And so I think that's another big takeaway, is that you really do have other benchmarks that are more informative than the METR graph. It's not the best benchmark out there, especially not now. To be fair to folks who have told me that, some of these only came out relatively recently, and so maybe they were half right 6 months ago. They're not right anymore. And if you look at these benchmarks that are much more realistic, expectedly, you see much more modest results. And I think what was so frustrating and was a major motivator for me to write the critical article that I did is that people are treating the METR graph as having real implications for forecasting things like real world AI adoption, existential risk from AI, like all of these like sweeping, systemically complicated issues that you could only really forecast in any detail with a sense of how models perform in messy, ambiguous real world contexts. And that's the exact opposite of what METR is looking at. And so you really should be taking a look at some of the benchmarks that are placing a high premium on realistic conditions under which to test models. And so one I like is the remote labor index. This is basically just how well do models perform at freelancing tasks that are already on Upwork. Only 4% about can perform better than human freelance workers. There's SWE Rebench, SWE Bench Pro Private. SWE Bench Pro Private is one I would really emphasize because it's looking at how models perform at engineering tasks from private proprietary repositories. That's really great because one, it means there's no contamination risk. This is all non-public. It can't be anywhere in models training data. And the second reason it's important is that those repositories are going to generally be more out of distribution for the main coding models than our big public repositories. So like another big benchmark, SWE-Bench Verified, and even SWE Rebench, this other benchmark up here, they're scraping tasks that are real tasks, but they're from GitHub repositories that are public. So the repositories themselves are in models training data. They're going to be a lot easier to bug fix if you're an AI coding model than are a private repository, right? And so if you really want to get a sense of, okay, how are these models going to be used in realistic business contexts, it makes much more sense to look at how they are performing on software engineering tasks in private repositories that are actually being used by real companies. And so that's why I think the fact that SOTA models are only resolving 24% of bug fixes scraped from these private repositories is pretty telling, especially when you compare that to SWE-Bench Verified, which is another big benchmark where they're completing like 80% or something like that. So basically, bottom line, and then I'm sorry, we'll break for questions after that point, is that it makes no sense to look at METR for forecasting sort of the real world trajectory of AI integration into the economy or sort of realistic AI capabilities rather than the benchmarks that are listed on the previous slide. And you guys will all have access to the slides so you can follow up on those. The second thing is that I think the METR graph and its reception is pretty clear evidence that the AI community is vulnerable to pretty systemic bias surrounding how to interpret safety and capabilities research, right? And that's because a lot of folks have perverse incentives connected to overhyping these products. I think that's really undeniable at this point. The next thing that no one reads the studies, even the experts, right? So I think all of these problems are severe enough that they should have come out in some detail soon after the benchmark was published and got all the public attention it did. I'd emphasize that in a lot of ways, I'm a complete amateur who should not be the person giving a talk like this in a perfect world, right? I don't have any formal training in machine learning. I have no formal training in AI research. I don't even have any formal training in social science. I was a philosophy grad student before I started doing this. And so it really is a kind of strange state of affairs that I'm publicizing some of these limitations of what is maybe one of the most influential studies on the planet right now. Like if you think about how influential the AI industry is, and in turn how aggressively they've been influenced by the METR graph, it is really a strange state of affairs that you don't have folks in professional AI research publicizing these limitations of this very important study. And then the last thing I'll say is just that I think we need to move as a community a little bit further away from thinking of models as having kind of static capabilities in a vacuum versus capabilities that are pegged to a specific elicitation context. Where what I mean by that is relative to the environment they're in and relative to the prompts that they're receiving within that environment. Right. Because, no model is doing anything in a vacuum, right? They're always responding to real queries by real people in specific environments. And as the research coming from a place like METR versus coming from a benchmark like SWE-Bench Pro Private makes starkly clear, there are these real divergences in apparent capabilities depending on context. And so I think we really need to think of model capabilities as being a kind of couplet between like performance and elicitation context, and not just performance with elicitation context being a kind of background concern, right? Like they really only ever go together, right? Models can't just do things; they can do things relative to a context and to a certain set of prompts, and that's really the only way you should ever be thinking about models' capabilities. Okay. I'm going to cut it there. I'm sorry, I ended up going a lot longer than I expected, but I can stay a little bit late for extra questions if you want. Thanks, guys.